Trump says a deal between the US and Iran to end the war in the Middle East could be signed on Friday. The US president also suggested the Strait of Hormuz could be opened by the end of the week. Ukraine was also on the agenda at the G7. Well, let's get more on what's been happening at the G7 meeting in France with Cormac Smith, who's former strategic advisor, who's former strategic communications advisor, Cormac, let me get that right, to one of Ukraine's previous ministers. It's good to have you with us. Thank you very much indeed for your time here on LBC News. In the last few moments, let's just talk about this. We've just heard that a Russian warship reportedly fired on a yacht in the English Channel. This is quite a bit of an escalation, isn't it, on an already tense situation between the UK and Russia?
You're ahead of me there. I've not heard of that. That would be a huge escalation, especially in following on from what we had only a few days ago, where we had British Marines seizing a Russian Shadow Fleet ship in the English Channel. And of course, then yesterday we had the breaking news that the Kremlin, it seems, was behind an arson attack on the home of the Prime Minister 13 months ago. So, there are some of us have been warning that Russia is waging war, albeit that a hybrid war, on us for certainly a decade in my case. But this is starting to really come home to us, Vanessa, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And those warnings that you were saying are also being echoed by the new Defence Secretary. And one would be wondering currently what options are available to the UK and indeed to NATO.
Well, we need to stop playing around. Russia always probes for signs of weakness, and a sign of weakness is a red rag to a bull to Russia. So we need to, not just Britain, but our other European and NATO allies, we really need to start acting reacting very, very robustly to Vladimir Putin and making it very, very clear that that such actions will not be tolerated. And I'm afraid in the past, there has been far too much appeasement in the way we have dealt with Russia. We've had the evidence for well over 10 years that Russia wages its hybrid, or some call grey zone warfare, against both us and other European countries. This has obviously escalated since the initial invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and then the further invasion in 2022. So, I think we need to start seeing far more robust responses from our leaders, not only in the UK, but across Europe.
Let's talk a little further about Ukraine that you mentioned, because Zelensky is at the G7 summit in France. How significant is it to have him there, maintaining that relationship, which we know with the UK? The UK always has made that very clear, its support for Ukraine. But with Trump, to be able to have that meeting with Trump, which I think something that he wasn't very keen on from what we're hearing some reports suggesting initially.
Look, Vanessa, it's hugely significant. And what I'm hearing, initially both Trump and Zelensky joined a G7 working group meeting, but not together. There was then the proposal that they should sit down one-on-one in the margins of the G7. Now, what I'm hearing was Zelensky initially was not that keen on that. And that would be in line with what Zelensky has and his administration have been saying for over a month now, that they have finally come out and said, it's very, very clear that Trump and his White House regime acts in Russia's interest and not in the interest of Ukraine. So it's reported, and obviously we're still working it out, but it's reported that Emmanuel Macron had to intervene to persuade Zelensky to sit down. They have sat down together. Trump made a very brief statement to say that it was a very useful and positive meeting. I think the one thing we can be sure about, the capitulation deal that both Putin and Trump tried to foist on Zelensky and the Ukrainians before Christmas, after the red carpet meeting in Alaska, that is simply not going to be accepted. It never was going to be accepted because, of course, it meant not only freezing the conflict along current lines. It meant conceding even more land to Russia. And I keep repeating this. It's important to say that some of the land that was to be, the additional land that was to be conceded was 20% of the oblast of Donetsk. That's a province in Ukraine. And this 20% critically is what they call the fortified belt. It is effectively the gateway to Kyiv and the rest of Ukraine. And it is something which Russia has been unable to take, not since February 2022, but actually since 2014, when this war began with, one, the illegal annexation of Crimea, and secondly, the invasion of Donbass.
Now, let's talk about Iran. Some optimistic tone coming from the US president. All eyes, of course, will be on Friday when we are expecting that deal to be signed. But one of the people I spoke to on the show yesterday said that, well, look, we've been here before. And so he seemed, I think, cautiously optimistic is probably the best way to describe that. Where do you sit on this?
I mean, I sit as we will believe it when we see it. We have not seen the details of the deal yet. What we have seen is, I have got to say, and I'm a former diplomat, so I can say this looks like a capitulation deal. It looks like Trump capitulating to the Iranians because he's got himself into a war which he simply cannot win, certainly cannot win without committing ground troops. And of course, 60% of the American population are against this war. But when it comes to putting troops on the ground, over 80%, including a majority of, well, should I say MAGA or Republican supporters, would be against it. So with the midterms coming up in the autumn, he simply doesn't have that option. So, you know, we're talking about completely opening the Straits of Hormuz. There is a question mark as to whether there will be some sort of a tariff charged by Iran on ships to go through the Straits, which of course is international water, and that never existed before. Trump has said that won't happen, but actually there is a big question mark over it. There's also the possibility of Iran benefiting from $300 billion in reconstruction investment that apparently is going to come from the other Gulf states. All sanctions being lifted on Iran. And of course, the horrible Iranian regime that murders tens of thousands of its own people being left in place. Now, of course, Trump will say now that regime change was never on the cards. But if we remember the rhetoric going back to the beginning of epic fury from both Trump and his so-called Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, it was very much about how they were going to bomb Iran into the Stone Age and they were going to decapitate the regime and so forth. So I'm not very optimistic about this. My best guess is that there will be a deal signed, which Trump will try very, very hard to sell as a victory to the American people. Spoiler alert, I don't think the American people will swallow it. But Trump needs to find a way out. This has been a massively costly war, not just for America in terms of ordnance and the horrible devastation wrought upon Iran and the other Gulf states. But as we've seen, it has been catastrophic for the world economy. So I think we're going to come out of this considerably worse off than when we went in. And of course, the critical issue of nuclear disarmament is to be postponed for 60 days after the signing of the deal on Friday. So very, very murky. It's very hard to say. I'm not feeling in a particularly optimistic mood.
Really, really interesting to get your thoughts there. Thank you very much indeed. And of course, all eyes will be on Friday. We'll be staying across